There's been so many contributions, both oral and written, about would the Anglo-Scottish Union come to an end or would it not? And precious little about one of the most intriguing historical aspects of the Union, why it has lasted for over 300 years. So that's, in a sense, the basic intellectual challenge that faces me this afternoon. But the second reason is to try and contextualize the debate which is going to follow, which will be about the future of the two countries in this existing union. And what I'll do, but very briefly do, in the final stage of the presentation, is try and link the question that I'm posing about survival, longevity, and continuity to, if you like, the bridge, a kind of bridge which starts to be built in the 60s and 70s when the Union starts to become more unstable than it had been at least since the middle decades of the 18th century. The 300-year plus experience of union between England and Scotland was neither inevitable or predictable. It's actually quite common for certainly common in Europe, for two ancient states, ancient nations, in this case England and Scotland, but it's quite common on the European continent and elsewhere for unions to disintegrate because of particular historical circumstances. Norway, Denmark, Spain, Portugal, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, and perhaps the most extraordinary and far-reaching and historical process of disintegration, the Soviet Empire, all embedded within a similar landmass in the last quartile of the 20th century. Moreover, if you look carefully at the Anglo-Scottish relationship in the late 17th century, before the Union, and into the early decades to the middle decades of the 18th century, the future of that association seemed problematic. For example, in a sense, you could argue that the high point, the apotheosis of the long struggle, the long period of arms struggle between England and Scotland only came to an end in the 1650s, a generation or so before the Union of 1707. And its apotheosis was the occupation, the military occupation of this country by Cromwellian forces between 1652 and 1660. So within the memory of many Scots, and particularly those who voted in the Parliament for the Union Act, was an association reaching back to the medieval period, that these two countries had had many generations, and in the medieval period, many centuries of strife and contestation for territory within Great Britain. Moreover, insofar as we can gauge the attitude of the populace outside the Parliament, and remember the extraordinary fact that until 1832, the Great Reform Act, only 0.2% of the population of this country had the vote. The population of Dublin had many more and a much greater electorate than the whole of the population of the nation of Scotland throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries. Insofar as we can gauge the position outside, there was much indifference in 1706-7, but there was also much hostility, especially in certain parts of Scotia, in particular the southwest Scotland and in some of the larger towns, and not least in what was going to become the great area of Jacobite strength in the northeast and in parts of the Gaeltacht, parts of the Highlands. In addition, Scotland was entering into, if you like, a marital relationship with the elephant, because in 1706-7, although the first private census, Webster census, is not until the 1740s, early 1750s, the population ratio was something like 6 English persons to every Scot. England was on the cusp of becoming one of the most powerful nations in the world. Scotland had just suffered the terrible crisis of the 7 or 5 lean years, the Darien disaster, the squeezing of Scottish trade through mercantilism, and the impact of European war in the later 17th century. It seemed that there was a condition of strength in one side of the relationship and a condition of weakness in the other side of the relationship. And the thing was, those Scottish members of Parliament who voted for incorporative union may have thought that this was a foundational, eternal and permanent treaty, but it wasn't. Because very soon after 1707, the Westminster Parliament, in which there was only a petty and semi-impotent group of 45 Scottish MPs, changed the ground plan in 2 important acts, the Toleration Act for Episcopalians and, even more important, the Patronage Act, which not only offended pious Presbyterians because it gave the final right of appointment to landowners rather than the kirk sessions and members of the church, a poisonous sore within the kirk, which ended up in 2 secessions in the 1730s and early 1750s, and of course eventually the Great Destruction of 1843 and the emergence of the Free Church. There was also in the first half of the 18th century almost a kind of revolution of frustrated expectations. The great hope was that the Union would be the panacea for all Scotland's late 17th century economic ills. By the time we get to the 1730s, the economy of Scotland, perhaps not in the state of serious weakness it was in the 1690s, but it's still relatively inert. There was change, and this is an important phrase, there was change within the system, but not of the system, until we get to the 1760s, 1770s, and the Great Scottish Leap Forward, which began in those 2 decades. Now, there's 2 indications that the Scots were already becoming fed up with the new Union Association. A long-forgotten fact to begin with. In 1713, a motion to dissolve the Treaty of Union of 1707 was only beaten by 5 proxy votes in the House of Lords. But even more crucially and more familiar, we now know from the studies of colleagues looking at the Jacobite movement, and particularly at the risings of 1709, 1715, 1719, and 1745-6, that although Jacobitism was a complex movement, one of its basic stimuli was opposition to the Union. And so you could argue that the Jacobite development was almost a metaphor for the dislike of the Union, not throughout Scotland, because this is a regional set of loyalties and oppositions, but in some parts of Scotland. I think there's little doubt then that if you look at the period from 1707 to the 1750s at least, there is instability in the relationship. An instability which I'll try to show only came back again from the 1970s, 1980s. And this is the instability that we confront today and which the panel will address both in its current form and its likely future form at the end of the lecture. What Scotland still feared by 1746 to 1750 was that the elephant would move into the bed, or to the other side, the Scottish side of the bed, would not simply make noises on one side of the bed, but would actually start to crush the smaller neighbour. In a sense, what happened to Ireland for much of the 17th and 18th centuries. The classic example of this was the drawing in to the Highlands of Scotland of 3 great Hanoverian armies as Charles Edward Stuart's forces retreated into the Highland Massif, supported by elements of the Royal Navy. After the disastrous defeat at Culloden, there was a systematic plan put into effect by the British state that this would never ever happen again. The original idea by Cumberland was to transport 50,000 clansmen and their families to the Caribbean. This was not put into effect. Instead, there was a systematic campaign of pillage, not only in the Jacobite areas, but in most parts of the Scottish Highlands and Islands, led, ironically, by some psychopathic Scots, such as Major Caroline Scott, who probably resented his Christian name, and therefore was determined to take it out on everybody else. Then we move into the 1760s, 1770s. There's a period in the 1760s, 1770s, which is still showing that the Scots are a distrusted lot by the elites in London. A, they're not allowed to bear arms under the Militia Act, and B, the rise of Scotophobia in the early 1760s. It's poisonous, it's venomous, and it's racist. And it's livid especially in the cartoonery of the London prints. Let me give you two examples. Immense swarm of locusts above the London skyline descending on the capital city. The interesting thing is that this swarm of locusts is dressed in tartan and playing bagpipes. This was a kind of print, if you like, of the fear that this ragged nation to the north was going to be feasting on England's rich pastures in this new association. And then even more intriguingly, the first Scottish Prime Minister, John Earl of Bute, in the early 1760s, massive rumours going about of a sexual liaison between him and the Queen Dowager. Nobody knows whether this was correct or false, but it was certainly a rumour which went around the court, and particularly in the metropole, in the metropolis itself. Semi-pornographic prints of a well-endowed John Bute, usually referred to in the cartoons as Boot, B-O-O-T, because he was tall, so he had long boots, and in a carnal situation with the Queen Dowager. And this again was a kind of metaphor or a piece of symbolism for Scotland's increasing penetration of the English Empire and of the goodies in London. But then, this is the interesting thing, as we move to the next phase of this development. From about the middle part of the Napoleonic Wars, down to I would say as late as the 1970s, both the elephant stays on its side of the bed and the union relationship is relatively stable. There was a Home Rule movement in the late 18th century, but it was a movement for, if you like, making the union more effective, rather than any sense which had an independence agenda. Even the foundation of the SNP in the 1930s, the way I read that, is because of the fact that the mainstream parties, and especially the Liberals and Labour, were beginning to move back from a position of support for Scottish Home Rule. And the situation had become so, if you like, unionist by the Victorian era, that historians have christened it banal unionism. In other words, it was not overt. It was simply a fact of conventional life. Nobody criticised it. Nobody even noticed it. It was simply part of the routine of everyday life. So the first analytical part of the lecture is why. In many states in the 19th century, where there was nationalist revolutions, the intelligentsia often led them, or certainly influenced them, especially during the revolutionary period of 1848-9. In Scotland, the galactic stars of the Scottish Enlightenment were unionists to a man, because they were all, or mainly, men. Not only that, but they rubbished the pre-history, the pre-union history of Scotland as factional, fanatical, intolerant, impoverished, and saw union as a liberation. So Scotland entered the early 19th century not with an intellectual elite, which was leading, if you like, an anti-union campaign or a strongly nationalist campaign, but one which was actually interested in what they called completing the union. That is an even more close association. And one of their obsessive areas was there should not be this distinction between Scottish and English law, because it's stopping the union being completed, and that is having effect on free market transactions in the common market, which had been created after 1707. That's a factor. A second factor was the Irish stab in the back. During the period from about 1797 to 1805, Great Britain was at bay and faced with Napoleonic armies across the Channel. In 1798, a great rebellion began in Ireland, hoping for French help to support an invasion, a liberation of Ireland and an invasion of England. At the same time, Scotland became the most militarised society in the UK, not only through the well-known Highland regiments, but by the fact that as late as 1799, there were something of the order of 58,000 Scots in the volunteer corps. That was 33% of the relevant male age group compared to 12% in England. England never forgot that. In its hour of need, the Scots were loyal, especially in a militaristic sense. Then we move on. It was by this time that quite extraordinary development was occurring. The overrepresentation of Scots in the English Empire. The aphorism being spoken that England ruled the empire, but Scots were increasingly actually running it. In my Centre for Diaspora Studies, which I have the honour to direct in this university, as we look at merchanting, governors, military officers, professors, medics, in almost all of these scales of professional or other influence, the Scots were overrepresented. At a time when they were 1 in 8 of the British population, in these cadres or strands of influence, they were often a quarter, a third, and particularly in areas like medicine, even greater than that. Beam me up, Scotty. Star Trek, on the bridge, some Americans, of the Starship Enterprise, some Americans, a Japanese, a Russian, and a Canadian Irishman who speaks with a peculiar Scottish accent. Why did the producers select a small country of 5 million people? Because in the novels of the 19th century, the Scottish banker, the Scottish, yes, that was the case then, the Scottish accountant, the Scottish doctor, the Scottish minister, the Scottish professor, the teacher, and the engineer were often icons, ethnic icons of this nation. But I would argue that one of the prime reasons for the stability of the Union down to the Great War was that the elephant indulged Scotland with benign neglect, It was a condition which we have come to call semi-independence. There were hardly any bills passed in the Parliament in relation to Scotland. Those that were usually made up by a Scottish cabal of MPs and then simply passed formally in the so-called sovereign parliament. Scotland itself, in a sense, ruled itself at the local level. The Kirk Sessions, the borough councils, the boards of supervision, and everything from lunacy to the prisons were made up of the Scottish bourgeoisie, the Scottish professional middle classes. And of course, one of the reasons why this was the case is because the state itself in this period was a bit of a pygmy. And so much of the activity, both in England and Scotland and Wales, took place at the local level. Of course, Westminster was sovereign in formality, but not really using that sovereignty because it goes back to the basic reason why England wanted the Union, because of its own internal security. And once that was preserved, there was no reason to be bothered with what went on in the north. Of course, then on to the period when one might expect the kind of instability in the relationship that we have seen over the last few years. The period from the Great War down to 1939. The horrible experience of Scotland. One might even say the agony of Scotland between 1914 to the mid-1930s. Some scholars have argued that the nation lost more men per head of population in the fronts of Gallipoli and Western Europe than any other combatant nation apart from the Serbs and the Turks, and they lost mainly through disease. That was an enormous an enormous trajectory into the confidence of the nation. Worse in a sense was to follow. The great hegemonic global structure of Scottish heavy industry reeled in the 1920s and early 1930s in the years of Great Depression during that period, with a third of the west of Scotland male formerly employed element, unemployed by 1931-32. And for the first time in Scotland's demographic history, at least in terms of known record from the mid-18th century, the emigration rate was so enormous that the population actually fell for the first time ever in Scottish history between 1921 and 1931. As one very distinguished journalist put it, the Scot is a man eclipsed. And one of the horrible consequences of that was the scapegoating by elements within the Scottish nation of the nation's biggest immigrant group, the Catholic Irish, many of whom are actually, ironically, not first-generation immigrants, but second, third, and fourth. But, and here's the irony, and Ruth will like this, between 1920 and 1939 of the 7 general elections, the Conservatives got a majority in 5 of them in Scotland. There was no evidence in the Labour Party of a switch to a nationalist directive or a nationalist solution. It seems to be the case that the depth of the crisis was such and was structural, in other words, it was ongoing, that the preference was the remaining armour plate, such as it was, of the British state. And of course, that was ongoing into the 40s, because of the extraordinary Britishness of that period. Not simply Britishness during the war, of fighting probably the worst and most evil foe that the nation's ever confronted, but moving into the period where I can remember in the late 40s and 50s, the comics, the war films, almost the obsession with the finest hour, a Britishness which was boosted considerably by the great takeoff in consumerism of the mid-50s, early to mid-50s onwards, and the housing revolution, which took place at the same time as the great schemes were created and the slums, or many of the slums, started to come down. And then what happened in the period when the empire was disintegrating from the late 1940s onwards, a so-called bastion of the Union, a new glue came on the scene, the welfare state, the cradle-to-grave security from the late 1940s, and in particular the National Health Service. If you're dealing with a slightly or significantly disadvantaged nation, as Scotland was in the 1930s, you can imagine the euphoric appeal of the welfare state in the late 1940s, 50s period. It was almost like, dare I say it, divine intervention. But that's with an I, by the way, rather than an E. So what happens? Few could have predicted the last 30-odd years in Scottish history. And that's primarily, ladies and gentlemen, why I constantly mouth the cliche, the future is not my period. Because you never know what is round the corner. There are structural forces operating in human society, but there's also things out there which trigger things that are unexpected, and you never know what is actually going to happen. As late as 1960, the Scottish National Party was not a party, it was a sect, hardly ever scoring more than 1% of the vote in national elections. In the 1950s, Scotland was a bastion, especially after Labour lost the election, the second election after the war, was a bastion of conservative unionism. I don't want to explain the reasons why we've got to this place. What I want, rather, is to give you a list in the last 2 or 3 minutes of my presentation, a short list of those elements, and we do not know whether the union is going to end or continue, of course, of those elements which have caused, the phrase I'm going to use is, instability in the Union. Obviously, the first is the rise of Scottish nationalism. The second is the elephant decidedly and vehemently, in female form, moved to the other side of the bed in the 1980s. I mean, it's important for you to realise in the long run of history that that movement which occurred in the 1980s had never occurred since the aftermath of the Jacobite Rebellion in 1745-6. That was why it was so decisive. The third thing is this: our electorates are diverging. Conservatism, and we all wish Ruth the best of luck with the Herculean task which faces her. The Conservative Party is still in a state of semi-disintegration. I've put the word semi in because Ruth's here. It's still in a state of I speak impartially, by the way, as an admirer of that great and ancient political party, but not as a member of SAME, by the way. The electoral patterns in England and Scotland are diverging. Scotland towards Labour and the SNP, both left, if you like, of centre. England still, to some extent, in the grip of a coalition government, which can, I think, be labelled authentically as right of centre, but depends on how you define right. That had never happened before to the same extent concurrently earlier in the 20th century. The second thing is, the next thing, possibly the most potent of all these variables, is the rise of English nationalism. The way I see Euroscepticism, the way I see the behaviour or the attempted behaviour of Nigel Farage in the High Street or the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, and the victories so far achieved and the votes so far achieved, this is a manifestation of the rise of English nationalism. And it's perhaps not surprising then that more English people, according to recent opinion polls, demand Scottish independence than do Scots. Then the final thing is the grand old party, Labour. It's obvious that if Labour had still been the dominant force in the Scottish Parliament, there wouldn't be a referendum in September 2014. The fact that there is going to be is a reflection of Scottish domestic policies and the overtaking, at least for a period, of the Scottish National Party by the overtaking of the Labour Party by the Scottish National Party. In conversation with the most recent Labour PM a number of weeks ago, Dr. Brown, a distinguished alumnus of this university, and especially of the Queen of all disciplines, because he's got an MA in history and also a PhD, he put forward the three-point argument. Members of his party at the highest level are still not comfortable totally with devolution. I mean, we just have to look at Tony Blair's statement in his memoirs. He wishes it had never happened. Secondly, and equally importantly, he admitted that the big hitters had gone to Westminster, and some of them, and none of them, apart from Dewar, had stayed in Holyrood. That seemed to send out a message. And the third thing was, the way he saw it, was a combination of the ossification of Labour after so many years in a position of hegemony in Scotland, and related to that, concerns about the neoliberalism of New Labour, and of course the Iraq War. So if you take these things together, these are, if you like, both manifestations of the instability and causes of the instability, and really then trying to set the scene for the discussion, the question and answer session which will take place from now on this afternoon. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.